Imagine you're 7 years old. It's winter. A bell explodes the silence at midnight. Cold stone presses your bare feet. A monk's hand guides pushes you into the dark church. Candles spit. 40 voices rise in Latin you barely understand. Miss a line and tomorrow the rod will sing. This isn't a nightmare. This is school. And before the hour is over, you'll be back in bed just long enough to dream of bread you cannot have, because dawn is coming, and the lessons will start again. Think you could last one day? Hold that thought, because what happens after class will shock you. When people picture the Middle Ages, they imagine knights and castles. But the true battlefield was the classroom, monasteries and cathedral schools, where education meant obedience, hunger, and the razor's edge of memory. Most children never went. Why learn to read when the plow tells you everything you need to know? Yet families poor and noble sometimes offered up their sons to the church as child oblates, a trade of a lifetime of service for food, shelter, and a narrow doorway to knowledge. Parents knew the bargain. Your boy would belong to God and the monastery forever. The rule was simple: no turning back. Training began at around 7, an age everyone understood as the border between babyhood and the hard road to work. For nobles, the plan was strategic. The eldest son inherited, the rest became the church's problem. Daughters not promised in marriage? Into the convent. A boy too frail to be a knight or born on the wrong side of the sheets? The cloister had room. It sounds cruel, but the monastery offered a certainty the world rarely gave 3 things children everywhere needed: routine, purpose, and the slim, dangerous promise of rising further than their birth allowed. By candlelight, the day unfolded like clockwork. Elfric of Eynsham, a bishop who knew the rhythm, tells us what it looked like. Picture this: midnight matins with the grown monks. A stumble back to bed, then dawn breaks, and school begins. The bell for prime cuts the lesson. Boys wash at the lavatory, mumbling the 7 penitential psalms while cold water stings their fingers. Back to church. Another slice of learning until terce and mass. More services, then finally dinner in the refectory, grace sung before and after food as ceremony. The afternoon brings a 3rd round of school. Vespers follows, then supper, then compline, and at last a bed and a first sleep. But here's the twist. The day isn't measured by what you understand. It's measured by how perfectly you conform, and the mind, like wax under a stylus, is pressed into shape. Speaking of wax, writing didn't start on paper. Parchment was precious. Paper came later and remained rare for a long time. So boys scratched letters into wax tablets with wooden styli, carving prayers and grammar into a surface you could smooth over and reuse. If the notes mattered, a scribe would later fix them on parchment. Imagine the tension. Every word must be captured by muscle memory because the page might vanish with one pass of the heat-blunted knife. This is why most examinations were oral. Knowledge lived inside you, or it didn't exist at all. Teachers wielded more than words. Corporal punishment wasn't a threat, it was policy. A lazy child or a negligent one could be stripped, held down, and beaten. The rod and whip weren't shameful tools tucked away. They were the badge of office, like a modern teacher's lanyard, except it stung. The message was blunt. The body remembers what the mind refuses. Do you think that worked? Quick poll: would a few lashes make you memorize faster, or would you run? Outside the monastery, cathedral schools were the height of learning before universities took shape. Children entered song school or reading school around 7, staying until 10 or 12. Song school drilled hymns, tune, and text so thoroughly that the choir became an extension of the classroom. Reading school taught the alphabet, the first syllables, and the great leap into Latin. Until the 12th century, Latin was the only classroom language. Then, gradually, teachers began to use the local tongue to explain difficult ideas. In England, they even taught French, a nod to the Norman elite. Writing, prayers, a pinch of arithmetic enough to reckon tides or count a merchant's tally rounded off the basics. If you mastered accounts and letters, you had a future as a clerk, a scribe, a servant of the quill instead of the sword. The latter was narrow, but it existed. Now, let's raise the stakes. Not every mind wanted the cloister's hush. Some burned to argue, to interpret, to heal. That's where the universities emerged: Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Salerno, city schools stitched together from guilds of masters and students. The curriculum was tight and unapologetic. 3 roads and 3 only: theology, law, medicine, everything bent back toward Christianity. The point wasn't freedom. It was mastery inside a framework the church blessed. Still, compared to the peasant's field, this was a new universe. Lectures were oral, notes sparse, books chained to desks. Students learned by disputation, public debate before a master, where quick wits cut sharper than knives, and a miscitation could humiliate you for weeks. If that sounds intimidating, it was. But careers were minted in those rooms. By the mid-15th century, Europe had about 80 universities. Bologna reigned in canon and civil law. Paris shone in theology. Salerno made medicine its craft. Oxford, which had been teaching in some form since 1096, swelled after King Henry II banned English students from studying in Paris. Teachers were stars with reputations that traveled faster than letters. John Leland, teaching in Oxford around 1401, won admiration for his crisp Latin and English grammars. Robert de Sorbonne, founder of the Sorbonne, built not only a college, but a code of conduct. He understood something modern educators still wrestle with: learning needs rules. Those rules were precise: no meat during Advent, none on Mondays or Tuesdays in Lent, and abstention between Ascension and Pentecost. Noise was banned. Scandal was worse. Come late to lunch from lectures and you'd still be fed. Come late because you were off on personal business and you earned bread, only bread. And women? No women of any sort shall eat in the private rooms. Violate the rule and pay a fine. Notice the logic. Reputation first, scholarship second, appetite a distant third. The college's image was part of your education. Clothing mattered as much as conduct. Gowns, closed garments, no fur trims, no red or green silk, no loud shoes, uniforms that made scholars immediately recognizable in a crowd, and perhaps targetable. At the Spanish College of Bologna, fashionable dress could cost you in penalties. Patrons stepped in to outfit students with proper robes, sometimes furred with sheepskin, sometimes plain, always in the statutory color with a matching hood. There's a hidden lesson here. Gowns weren't nostalgia, they were regulation, a leveler that smoothed the ugly edges of status while declaring you part of a tribe. Step out of line with pointed shoes or flashy hoods, and your wallet would feel it. Still, even the best gown doesn't pay rent. University towns were expensive, and students were perpetually broke. One letter from Oxford, written in abysmal Latin, begs a patron for help. Lodgings, necessities, many other things which I cannot now specify. And the sharp punchline, without Ceres and Bacchus, Apollo grows cold. Translation, without food and wine, the muse refuses to sing. You can almost hear the smirk. Tell me in the comments, was that poetic charm, or a medieval version of Send Money PLZ? Money wasn't the only problem. Universities lived under the church's umbrella, which often exempted scholars from city law. A student could insult a tradesman and face ecclesiastical courts rather than a magistrate. Taxes pinched the town while the colleges prospered. Masters haggled for lecture halls and rent like seasoned guild leaders. The result was friction that built from simmer to boil, and every university town knew the phrase that still haunts Oxford and Cambridge: town and gown. Students promised to take their silver elsewhere if the mayor squeezed too hard. Sometimes they did. In the 14th century, Lisbon's university decamped to Coimbra. In 1229, after a riot, Paris shut down for 2 years. Education had feet, and those feet could walk. And then came the February of 1355, Street Scholastica's Day at Oxford, when a sour cask of wine became a spark in a powder store. 2 students at the Swindlestock Tavern argued with the taverner, then hurled the wine in his face, a stupid prank in any age. But Oxford was tinder. Within hours, fists turned to cudgels. Cudgels became swords. Friends called friends. Apprentices, scholars, townsmen, all dragged into the streets as rumors multiplied like rats in a granary. Over 3 days, the violence rolled back and forth. Halls were invaded, terrified students dragged out and beaten, shops smashed, fires lit. King Edward III ordered peace, but words meant nothing to men with blood in their eyes. By the time the smoke thinned, 63 scholars lay dead, with townsmen lost in uncounted numbers. 19 student halls were wrecked. Ash painted the sky. Who was to blame? Each side argued the other started it. Each side had witnesses. Each side had dead to mourn. But the king's judges pronounced against the town. The mayor and his bailiffs went to the Marshalsea, the jail, whose name was a sentence in itself. The town paid a fine of 500 marks and, more cruelly, an annual payment of 100 marks that bit year after year. To rub salt in it, they were forced to mark the massacre's anniversary with a solemn mass for centuries, a ritual reminder that learning had won and the town must bow. Peace returned, but suspicion didn't. Town and gown would fight again, never quite as brutally, but often enough to etch the lesson into Oxford's bone. Now, step back a moment. Was medieval education only pain in rulebooks? Not entirely. There was wonder, too. Imagine a boy who first hears the great Latin hymns and feels his throat vibrate with the choir's roar, a joy so physical it feels like the world is singing through him. Imagine a novice who copies a page of scripture without a single blot, a victory of patience over the trembling hand. Picture a student who travels 100 miles on bad roads because he heard a certain master in Bologna can explain Gratian's decretum like no one else alive, and when he arrives, the lecture opens like a locked door, and the law suddenly breathes. In that sense, medieval classrooms weren't tombs. They were greenhouses. They grew minds that would argue, systematize, preserve, and slowly stretch the edges of what Europe thought it knew. But the cost was real. Sleep deprivation trains obedience. Fear trains silence. The rod teaches the body to sit still, but it can also teach the mind to flinch. The medieval classroom taught millions of prayers and a habit of discipline that built communities capable of reading, singing, counting, and governing. It also taught that knowledge belonged to the few, that language could be a fence, and that mercy was a rare guest unless the rulebook invited her. Hold that in your mind as we pivot to the details of a school day and to the small ways children navigated a system built for men. At dawn, lessons began with the alphabet and syllables, turning letters into sounds, sounds into syntax. Boys mouthed prayers as mnemonic ladders, climbing to grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the trivium before any dream of theology. Teachers stood near, stylus ready for the wax tablet, rod ready for the spine. Reading wasn't for pleasure, it was for power. To chant the office, to count the tithe, to file the charter, to argue the canon. The songs of the choir doubled as drills in pronunciation and timing. The refectory doubled as a classroom, its silence broken only by a monk reading from scripture while others chewed. If you're picturing a school where every object does 2 jobs, you're seeing it clearly. In England, local flavor crept in. French lessons sat beside Latin. Later, instruction in the vernacular helped younger students cross the river of grammar. But don't picture modern bilingual classrooms. This was triage, enough of the mother tongue to keep the lesson moving, as much Latin as possible so the boy could join the great conversation of the church. The written word wasn't democratically spread, it was carefully targeted. A clerk could draft a letter that sent grain from a monastery's storehouses to a hungry village. A scribe could duplicate a charter that preserved a widow's rights. In those moments, literacy became rescue. In other moments, it became leverage. Meanwhile, the universities tightened their grip on prestige. In Paris, Theology lectures wrestled with the nature of God and the proper balance of reason and revelation. In Bologna, law students memorized, recited, and disputed until legal principles clicked like puzzle pieces, turning chaos into code. Salerno taught the body, humors, herbs, diagnosis. Medicine was still bound to ancient authorities, yet the craft of observation sharpened. Oxford churned with energy teachers like John Leland refined grammar, while rules from Robert de Sorbonne's vision echoed across the Channel through colleges that enforced silence, fasts, and fines. A gown was a passport, recognized in every scholarly town from the Seine to the Arno. But the gown also painted a target. Exempt from city courts, students swaggered. Some were genuinely pious, some brilliantly diligent, some simply 18 and reckless. Taverns welcomed them. Landlords tolerated them, but a sneer, a skipped payment, a drunken shove, any of these could ignite fury. Think of the Swindlestock Tavern as a symbol, the place where scholarship met appetite, where a bad cask could become a death sentence. If it feels uncomfortably modern, that's because human nature has a longer history than any university. And yet, for every riot, there were 1,000 quiet triumphs. A boy in a song school learned perfect pitch and carried it into a lifetime of worship. A clerk mastered accounts and kept a monastery solvent through a poor harvest. A student in Bologna copied a legal gloss so clearly that another student, a century later, could learn from it. Education leaves footprints you seldom notice until you step where someone else once stood, and the ground holds. Let's return to the child, Oblate, the 7-year-old dragged from sleep to matins. What did he dream of? Maybe bread, maybe sunlight, maybe a day without fear. Or maybe he dreamed of letters turning into words and words into doors. Not every student loved the system, but many loved what the system could unlock. That tension powered medieval schooling, the friction between a strict machine and the minds it ground into shape. When later centuries loosened the grip, when paper spread, when printing exploded, when languages other than Latin were allowed to carry serious ideas, those old habits didn't vanish. They became the scaffolding for universities that still demand gowns, still keep ancient rituals, still argue in public, still believe that knowledge, pressed hard, can change a life. Because here's the deepest twist of all. For the medieval student, school was a bet. Obedience now for opportunity later. Loss of childhood for a vocation beyond your birth. A voice trained to sing the church's song, and a mind sharpened to defend it. Some won that bet, rising from a peasant hut to a scriptorium, from a minor clerkship to advising a bishop, from the choir stalls to a university pulpit. Others lost, broken by the rod or by poverty or by a riot they never chose. The textbooks changed. The gamble didn't. In a way, it still hasn't. And that's why our journey matters. When modern students return to glass and brick campuses every September, they walk behind those same shadows, the call to rise early, to listen closely, to remember precisely, to argue without fear, and to recognize that a community will always ask sacrifices from its members. Today the rod is gone. The uniform is optional. The exams are written, but the echo remains. The bell still rings. The first page still waits. And the question, what are you willing to trade for knowledge, still demands an answer. So, if you ever see a graduation gown and wonder why it exists, remember the Spanish college at Bologna with its fines for pointed shoes, the Sorbonne's rules about silence and supper, the Oxford students marching in borrowed dignity through a town that hated them, the townspeople counting costs and muttering resentment, the candles guttering in a midnight matins while a child tries not to yawn. Remember that education has always been a drama of order and rebellion, hunger and plenty, rule and exception. And remember the Swindlestock Tavern, where a splash of wine became a river of blood, proof that learning doesn't float above the world. It sits in the middle of it, soaked, battered, and absolutely alive. If this dive into medieval classrooms rewired how you picture school, subscribe for more brutally honest journeys through the Middle Ages. There's so much more to uncover.